Hello and welcome to a new series for Great British Landscapes. In this series we'll be talking to some photographers about their favourite pictures and how they post-process them. We'll be going from the original capture, either a scan of film or a raw file, and looking at the processes involved, maybe looking at some of the Photoshop techniques used, and looking at why they made the changes they did, maybe discussing some of the reasons, philosophical or moral, why they made certain changes. This first picture is one of mine I took on a trip to Egg in 2010 with Dav Thomas, Paul Arthur, Richard Childs, Tamara Kuzminski and Jenny McClellan. We stayed in a small cottage in Cleedale, I think, near the Bay of Lake, and although a lot of the photography was done on the coastline there, both myself, Dav Thomas and Tamara got a little bit fed up of the view of Rum and decided to take a walk up into the forest. As we walked down the main road we saw a fantastic little abandoned cottage, a run-down building, and surrounding this building was huge bushes of fuchsia. And I'll show you whereabouts the place we stayed was. This is the Bing maps of Scotland, so we can see Scotland here. And as we zoom into just below the Isle of Skye, we've got Rum and Egg. So we'll take a zoom in. One of the nice things about Bing maps is that they also include the 1 to 50,000 and 1 to 25,000 ordnance survey maps. Very useful for planning trips. So let's take I'll just come back out for a second. A lot of people when they stay in Egg stay in the main part of the island, which is where the ferry comes in. We were looking for somewhere where we could easily access the Bay of Lake and Singing Sands without having to use a car or use the taxi. So the place we actually stayed in was, I believe, gone a little bit too far, this small building here. It was a very small cottage, quite run down, but very cheap, and it was a very short walk to get to the coastline here. As it was, me, Dav and Tamara walked back up the main road, and we ended up walking through this forest path, and Dav went all the way through this forest to get a few pictures. But whilst we were on the way there, we found the little cottage around here. Interestingly, when we were there, it may have been sleep deprivation, but I'm pretty sure we found the only banana flavoured blackberries on the whole island. In fact, the only ones I've ever tasted, ever. Anyway, back to the picture. This was taken with my Ebony large format camera. One of the things about large format cameras is you only have prime lenses, so in certain cases you can't frame the picture quite as you wanted. I probably didn't want to include some of this top left hand side of the picture here. However, I didn't want to crop too closely to the window, and one of the decisions I made when I was taking it was that I would probably do something to either darken down this top left hand section or to distort the perspective of the picture to move that out. Now I'll come back to that in a moment. And this is the original scan done on my drum scanner, and we'll take a look at some of the things I did to work on it. But first of all we'll zoom in and take a look at the quality of the drum scan. If we go to 100%, you can see that the drum scan's brought in a huge amount of detail, far more than we would really need. And one of the things it has done is shown just how horrible birds can be sometimes. One of the first things I did was to get rid of this bird poo. Now this is not quite as easy as just cloning things out, because we don't really have anything to clone from here. What I did in the end was to borrow a small piece of leaf from one of these other plants, one of these other flowers over here, and stretched it out to be able to fill in and then clone into that area. So let's have a look. What I'll do here is I'll try and show you roughly what I did. Let's start with this leaf here as an example. I'm not sure if this is the one I used, but it should work well to show you the idea. If I copy and paste that, you can see that I've got quite a nice bit of texture to play with. With a little bit more distortion. This is going slightly slow because this file is 1.6 gigabytes. Now, I should have probably downsized it before I started playing, but right, here we've got our source material in place to be able to clone out. I've started using a Wacom art pad for a lot of my work. I find them very useful, especially when making subtle changes to files. So let's take a look at what I can do quickly with this. What I'm going to do is get the erase brush out and try and remove some of this file. Now it's not perfect, but hopefully you can see the idea is that I can adapt what I found there to get rid of the bird poo without making horrible clone marks in the file. I'm going to close this file now because this is the original scan and it's quite large. And I'm going to go to my downsized version. I'm just going to check the size of this briefly. That's 2000 dpi, so this should be easier to work on. And if we go into that flower again, we can see how I've worked on it, and I've taken some aspects of other plants. I'm not going to be able to find the right one, but I've filled in the details to try and create a convincing, clean flower. What I'll do now is I'll show you the original and then my final version. So there's the original, and I'll briefly go through the things that I've done. One of the next things I did was to take areas like the grasses and some of the brighter bits of grass at the bottom and dulled those down. So there's the quite bright bits of grass, and I've knocked them back. So I haven't knocked them back a huge amount, but it's enough to stop your eye from wandering into those areas. Now conversely, I've also increased the contrast in some of these leaves. So if you look at the original leaves, the light wasn't particularly directional, it was quite dull. So we've got quite a flat look to the leaves here. There's some nice light showing where the shadows change. So the back of these leaves are in shadow and the foreground leaves are in a bit of light. And what I've done is I've taken this idea of graduated light and extended it into some of the leaves down here. So if we look here, the leaves are quite flat, and here I've put some shaping light on the leaves to try and give them a little bit of glow. One of the last changes I made was to address this area in the top left of the picture. I didn't like the way this area was drawing the eye, and so, as I discussed earlier, I used the perspective tool in Photoshop, and I also probably used the distort tool to stretch the area in the top left out of the picture. So if we look at the changes here, I've pulled the top left up to make the top left a lot cleaner. This has had the effect of stretching out the window slightly, which is one of the windows was a big feature for me. It's this idea of seeing through a window into a building which has got a forest in the background, and I found that quite appealing. Okay, so the first thing I'll take a look at is adjusting the perspective of this picture. And if we compare this image with the final image, you can see what I've tried to do is clean up this top left area of the image. In this version we've got a lot of mess. The branches are leading out, and one of the things I wanted to trim out was this area of complicated branches. In the aim of simplification, what I've done is I've cropped out the left hand side of the picture. So I'm going to change the size of this image, otherwise we'll be here for ages trying to resize things when we change the dimensions. And now we'll try to use the distort tool to apply the changes we were talking about. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take the left hand side out to the point where I wanted to crop the image, which was, I think, on the edge of these branches. I'll probably take it to about here. I'm looking basically at the edge here to see it for distractions, and this feature here I don't like, and the curve here is potentially eye distracting areas. So if I can simplify, I'll probably take it out to about here. Undoubtedly this won't match up with my final version, because every time I try and post-process a file they look different. Now, the final adjustment is to try and remove this top left feature. So let's take this up quite a way, and I think we can probably get away with distorting that there. Now that's quite a dramatic distortion, and how you could say, how can I justify that amount of change to a picture? Well, whilst I've been using a large format camera, one of the things that we do is to use the movements a large format camera has to be able to adjust perspective in a picture. Now we can take a picture and we can reweight it, so we can emphasize different parts, so we can make the bottom part of a picture grow, or the top part of a picture grow. It's in the same way when you are shooting a picture in the woods, and if you shoot up towards the trunks of the trees converge at the top, or if you shoot down towards the floor, the trees converge at the bottom. And we can, in large format, make those changes without actually shooting up or down, so we can take a picture head on and we can use the movements of the camera to be able to squeeze or open out the top or bottom of a picture. Now this is something that's been done for a long time. It's nothing new, and it's, as I was making these changes, I realised that these are fairly arbitrary changes. They're not natural changes, and nobody looks at the pictures as a result and goes, they're wrong, they don't look natural. And I thought, well, if those are justified, why can't I make the same sorts of changes using Photoshop instead of a lens? And with the proviso that the result still looks natural, and we're not making something look wrong, I think it's perfectly valid to do so. So we'll take a quick look at what we've done here. The main thing I've wanted to do is keep my window vertical. I mean, that's an aesthetic decision. And I think I've probably got a very similar result to what I was looking at in the final file. And I think this is something that's underused, and I'm quite happy to do this in the aid of achieving satisfactory compositions. So the next thing I want to show you is my technique for adding the highlights, adding the change in light across the picture. If I bring in my layers palette, I'll just dispose of this sharpening layer I've put in, save a little bit of time. What I tend to do is apply a curves layer to begin with, and I have a look around my area that I'm working on, and if I use the adjustment layer palette, you should be able to see I can use the tool to drag points up and down. I can roll over these leaves to find out whereabouts the tones are I'm working on. And as I walk around the leaves, I can see that they are in this area here. Now, if I want to increase brightness or contrast around the area, first of all I can push up the brightness, and then what I'll do is I'll put a little bit of a curve on there, so I'm actually increasing the contrast difference in those areas as well. And if I switch that on and off, you should be able to see there's an increase in colour as well, so we'll just switch the increase in colour off. So all we're interested in is brightness. So the way I did that was move it to luminosity blending mode instead of normal blending mode. And once I'm happy that that's sort of giving the increase in contrast I want and brightness, I highlight the curves layer and use Command I, Apple, Control I to invert it. And that's taken my effect off completely. Now I'll switch over to using the brush, my Wacom art pad, and I'll move to the brush tool, change the flow on the brush tool to about 30% so I can repeatedly brush into an area, and I'll go and try it out on some leaves. So the trick to some of these changes is to not just put this change everywhere. I can see in the picture where I've got some of the contrast changes I like. It's providing contrast across the leaves, so where you've got a change in brightness of a leaf, just brighten one side, for instance. If you sometimes want to brighten both sides, that's fine, but I find it's the distribution of these things that gives a 3D effect. And if you have an area that has a shape to it, so let's take this area of leaves for instance. Naturally, if I have a directional light, and I know my directional light's coming from, let's have a look, from this direction, top down, which is why the leaves are dark on the inside there, I want to try and make this have more shape. So if I imagine it as just a sphere or a ball, I'm going to have more light on this side than I'm on this side. So when I'm applying my changes, I'll be brushing in more changes around the top of this section than I do around the bottom section here. So I can apply some highlights around the edges. I'll do the same up here. And I could say it's a laborious task, but it's quite relaxing once you get into it. Now I look across these shapes now and I say, right, how do I differentiate some of these areas? So I've got an area in here where I've got a leaf in the foreground and some in the background, and those are sort of merging into each other. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to do the opposite, and I'm going to create a curves layer that is going to darken areas. I'm then going to invert it and switch it back off, And I can use my paintbrush tool to paint into the dark area now. So if I darken some of the areas in the background. Now don't worry that some of these changes may look a bit too harsh. One of the nice things about having the changes looking harsh is I can always back off them, but it's very easy to tell where the changes are and what they're doing and which bits you've already looked at. So I've darkened those areas. I'm going to go back to my foreground now and I'm going to lighten some of these leaf areas. Well, hopefully what that should do is provide a little bit of differentiation between those two sections. And I can do that, I think the rest of it's not looking too bad there actually. These areas are looking quite bright anyway. What I will do is try and put some highlights on these leaves in the background here, so they show up a little bit better. And this should hopefully give an idea of a glow about these leaves that maybe wasn't completely there at the time. There's a little bit of a glow about it, but what I'm doing is I'm enhancing it, I'm interpreting it. And okay, let's take a quick look by I'm going to group those layers together so I can switch them off and on. I'm just going to use the mouse to do that, and I'm going to zoom in on that area so you can see what's happening. So you can see there's a fairly dramatic change there. If I come out to the overall picture, I've got a fairly flat range of tones across there, and hopefully what I've done by changing some of the tones on the leaves is to create some differentiation and some shape in these leaves. It's not over the top, I don't think, and if I feel it is over the top I can always back off slightly, make it look a little bit more natural. And I look at this and play with it and come back to it. What I'm trying to do is look at the paths and the shapes. I know what shapes these are, and I know what I want to emphasise and de-emphasise. And I'm trying to create more of a 3D effect. So if I go back to the final picture now, here's my final picture. Hopefully you can see that I've created these subtle changes to try and make things stand out within the picture. Now, the last thing I was going to look at was a change to a branch I didn't like. Sorry, I couldn't actually find it again. Now, these are things you may find insignificant. The picture is very complicated as it is. Does it really matter? And the bit I'm looking at is this single branch here. Now, in the big scheme of things, not particularly important, this branch here. But for me, when I want people to start looking into this window area here, I don't want bright lights catching their eye. And so what I've done in the final picture is to take that branch out completely. Now, whether you think that's significant or not, I'm looking at it now and thinking maybe it wasn't that significant after all. However, it might be nice to be able to see how I go about cloning things out, because there is a technique to it, and I tend to use a variety of tools depending on what I'm doing. This should be fairly basic, so I'll do this one as a demonstration, and then we can look at some more complicated ones in a future program. Always good to zoom well into a picture when you're doing cloning. So the first tool I typically use for cloning is a brush heel. Now a brush heel lets you pick a source by clicking on Alt, and then you can brush over an area. Now it would be tempting when you're dealing with areas like this to be able to use a very, very small brush and go in and paint little bits in a bit at a time, but you end up with it smearing. Brush heel isn't very nice when you're doing little bits at a time. I tend to use a bigger brush and try and do large lumps of area. Now, very often you'll get colour effects you don't want, so I know the colour behind there is green, so I'm going to pick up another green from over here, and I'm going to work on an area down at the bottom here. And I'm going to do again a little bit there. I'm going to do again a little bit here. Another bit there. And these are, as you can see, leaving evidence behind that I've cloned things out. And the reason this is leaving evidence behind is because I've got a very bright object and I'm working to try and replace it with some dark colours, so I get evidence of the overlap between the brights and darks. So let's go back to the start again. What you can do to be able to trick the brush heel tool into getting a good result is by first of all cloning in some colour. We're not looking at a perfect fix here, we're looking at something that's going to be close. So and one of the things I do when I'm working on edges, whenever something crosses an edge, I try and pick something perpendicular to that edge. So I know this transition looks similar there, so I'll work on that little edge there. And I'll fill things in a little bit at a time. Again, we're not looking for perfect. What we're trying to do is just match up the tones so that when we do a brush heel, the brush heel won't be looking at the bright tones in the background and trying to match them. Hopefully it will see that the tones are very similar and won't cause lots of problems. We won't get the smearing that you usually get when you're doing this sort of change. So let's go back to the brush heel again now and use a wide setting. And we can sort of dab in here, painting in sections a bit at a time. You might think this is one of the easiest ones because what I'm replacing is some bokeh or out of focus blur areas in the background. But this can be one of the more difficult areas because the bokeh's got a gradation across it that's often quite difficult to reproduce. And one of the things to be wary of as well is these, when you do a clone like this, you clone patterns. So I've taken the brush tool here, use this as a source and put it here. So I've ended up with two areas that have got a similar pattern in them. In order to do that, I take one and I brush it out. So I'm not sure if I've got any of these patterns here. Possibly got some evidence between these two, so I'll do a similar one again. And it's a matter of going in and dabbing things out and backing off if things don't look quite right. Like there, that one came out too bright. And then the final bit is cleaning up the very, very edge. And this edge work can be done by finding somewhere that's got similar tones, so maybe down here. Rolling over, I've brought some green into that, which I probably don't want, so I'll go to the clone tool again. Bring in some tones for what I'm trying to get at, and then clear up some of the edges. So I'll use the what I'm doing is I'm looking for another leaf that has a clean edge there, so it might be that leaf over there, for instance. So there's always patterns you can use from somewhere else, and this edge there now looks quite harsh, so I'm going to use this grey area here to paint in some detail, hopefully. And if you dab very small areas of the brush tool, it just works as like almost a blur tool. It's a blur tool, but taking a pattern from somewhere else. If we come out, we should have a clean area like this. What I would probably do with this area now, if I was trying to simplify it, I would say that these final little bits of bright branch here are maybe too bright. So let's try and over-egg this a bit and do a quick selection for a quick fix on these very bright areas. I tend to use the segmented selection tool rather than trying to freehand draw a path. I find you can get a lot better control. And then I apply a feather afterwards. I know some people don't work like this, but it works for me. Now the feather, I just want it to encompass the area. I never work with very sharp feathers. There is the danger that even though you think you've done things well, on that very sharp feathered edge you can end up with artifacts like banding or such like. So I know now I have a nice feathered edge around those highlight areas. I'm now going to apply an adjustment mask, and I'm going to wind down the top right side of it. Now it's going to take all the values down in this area, and then I'm going to bring up the values in the centre. So what I've done is basically rolled off the highlights in this area, and that shouldn't look false, but it should reduce the attention that that area drags. Now let's have a look at, I'm going to put my tablet away, and I'm going to do a before and after on that small area there. So if we go back to the before, you can see that it was incredibly bright before. Now I'd say perhaps that's gone a little bit too far, so I'll use the opacity tool to bring a little bit back in. And there we go. This is I'm not trying to go through a lot of the changes I made to this picture, but give you a flavour of the post-processing I did. And hopefully I'll be able to bring some more of these types of post-processing videos to you from other photographers and from myself with other pictures. Thank you very much.